So yeah, today I'm going to be talking about the ultimate potential of virtual reality. So by now I've asked well over 1,000 of the leading pioneers in virtual reality this question, and people always ask me what do I think the ultimate potential of VR is, and I think this talk will be a good take of my answer to that question. So I've been doing the Voices of VR since May of 2014. Talked to well over 1,000 of VR developers and well over 2,000 experiences, and trying to, in some sense, get an idea of where this is all going. This is a completely new paradigm, and to me, it's super exciting about what's possible. And so I've, in some ways, by doing the podcast, having people really meditate on that question of the ultimate potential of virtual reality. So what is the ultimate potential of virtual reality? Well, I see that the answer could be summarized into these different domains of human experience. If you were to talk about virtual reality, like it's about what it means to be human, and I feel like it's everything from entertainment and medicine and connecting to your relationships and partners and dealing with death and grieving and higher education, travel, spirituality, career, your friends and community, if you're isolated, being able to express your identity and be embodied, having an exchange of value with resources, having early education and communication, and then finally home and family. So I'm going to be diving into each of these sections in kind of a lightning quick, in some ways the biggest ideas that I could think of. This is in some ways an impossible question to ask, the ultimate potential, because the ultimate potential of humanity is unending, but it's interesting to look at it through the lens of VR to get a sense of where it's at now and where it could go in the future. So if you look at the Simon Wardley's model of technological evolution, this is something I've been thinking about a lot because I think it's helpful. You start with the genesis of an idea, and then it moves into a custom bespoke enterprise application, and then it moves into a consumer product, and then finally at some point it's just a mass ubiquitous commodity. And VR is on this technological diffusion curve since like 1968 and in the 90s, and then now we have the consumer launch, and we're moving into this path of ubiquity either, I'd say, by 2025 or 2045. It kind of depends on what happens over the next couple of years to see if it's something that's going to reach that mass ubiquity sooner or later. But I think it's inevitable that it's going to happen. So we have these other models of crossing the chasm into the mainstream. We're still at the innovators, early adopters, and we're trying to sort of make that jump into the early majority. But I think that with what I see, what's happening in technology, that we're well on this path towards that vision of having immersive technology, spatial computing, be the next new paradigm in computing. So I'm going to be going through the different domains of human experience, and we're going to be really focusing on some ways. At the beginning, there's entertainment, there's medicine, there's enterprise applications, and then higher education training, I think are the ways that is going to bootstrap the VR industry in the short term because there's so many compelling applications, and me kind of unpacking some of the concepts and ideas of why I think that. But eventually, we're going to see the consumer market of VR reach all of these different domains of human experience. So let's start with entertainment. So immersive storytelling, I think, is probably one of the most exciting domains for VR because we love stories. We go see stories all the time. And so one of the things that I'd say is that there's an existing hero's journey from Joseph Campbell, and that's the Yang archetypal journey where there's an individual who's making choices and taking action and going on this adventure to be able to individuate as a hero. And I think the Yin archetypal journey is something that we don't necessarily understand or quite have well defined, but the way I describe it is that it's more about ego dissolution and more about you recognizing how you're connected to the larger whole. And it's more about you being connected to your own sense of embodiment and your own sense of emotional presence. And so, I'll be actually diving into this in a full hour in another talk later today to really kind of unpack this experiential design framework. But at the heart, it's about making choices and taking action is the active presence and mental social presence. That's the Yang archetypal journey. And the Yin archetypal journey is more about your sensory experience, emotional immersion, and the embodied presence and emotional presence. And this is, I think this way of thinking about it, I think is a way to really kind of get a sense of what is happening in storytelling in VR. We also have this concept of the living story and participatory media, where immersive theater is a great, metaphor to think about how you are now having the choice to be able to participate in moving your body through space in order to understand how a story is unfolding. And immersive theater is a good sign of where that is going to go. But in essence, you no longer are just a passive consumer, but you're an active participant in the media. The holodeck is something that we see from science fiction, and I think it may actually be closer than we think. If you think about what would it mean to have a digital light field display completely immersed in it, where it's literally like looking through a window into another world, and it would actually be sort of radiating out the photons, so it would like make you feel like you were actually there. If you had an entire room that was filled with light field displays, then you may have a future where you're not actually wearing a headset, but that you're getting the visual input where you actually believe that you're in that place. So another concept I think is key is flow states. And so as you're making choices and taking action, you have different dimensions of flow, and you have two dimensions of both the challenges and the abilities, and that you really want something that's high challenge, high ability, and that's in that peak flow state. But I think that as we start to cultivate flow states within virtual reality, we're able to actually build our capacity for flow and bring that back into our lives day to day. And so I think that what it means to actually be in the flow state all the time and what you do in your work, I think a lot of people get caught up in emails and other things that, like you may not necessarily be in the flow, but what if we start to cultivate that as a practice, we're gonna, I think, have more flow in our lives. So I think it's going to also bootstrap the creative economy where there's going to be if we're moving from the information age to the experiential age, then what's it mean to actually have people that want to actually own, they want to have access to the experiences rather than owning something. And so if the currency of the next generation is going to be that experience, then there's going to be a whole creative class of people cultivating and creating experiences for people. And I think for virtual reality, that kind of reduces a lot of the ideas of scarcity, and there's a sense of abundance that has like more of the yin currency dynamics, that the more you give, the more you get. And as we move into moving away from resource-constrained economies and more into the creative economy, then we're going to have more of those yin currency open source dynamics. So that's the entertainment. Let's move on to medicine, because I think that there's a lot of concepts within the medical field that once you unpack, it has these huge implications for virtual reality. So neuroplasticity is just this idea that you can rewire your brain. You can change the visual input. So James Blaha, for example, was able to train himself to be able to see in 3D for the first time by training his weak eye, by giving it more signal, but it was able to train it so that he could see in 3D, both in the virtual reality, but also in his day-to-day life. And so you can go into VR, have a direct neural input into your brain, rewire your brain, and then that changes how you interact with the day-to-day world. You're literally changing the way that you see the world when you go into VR. So taking ownership of your health. So rather than going into a doctor and having the doctor cure you, you're going to be much more on your own of being able to take responsibility for your own health. And I think that's one of the trends that I see. It's like this democratization of agency into your own health and healing. And rehabilitation is one of those domains, but there's a number of other ones. Healing trauma, I think, is another one in terms of being able to have some sort of exposure to a stimulus that allows you to work with a counselor to cathartic your emotional experiences, and that when you express your emotions and tell your story and have that story be heard, then that's the core essence of what it means to have this healing from trauma. So there's this dimension of truth and reconciliation that can come through what's facilitated through the virtual reality technologies. The early work that's been done by Skip Rozo here with PTSD and trauma, I think, is really encouraging where this could go as that gets scaled out to the entire world. So I think it's going to revolutionize all dimensions of medicine. Walter Greenleaf has this slide here where he goes through all the different dimensions of how VR is going to be applied for both the training and the assessment and the application of medicine and rehabilitation. So there's just almost every domain of medicine is going to be revolutionized by virtual reality. And so this is going to be one of the early adopters of VR. And so if you're looking into eventually doing storytelling, I think the applications of medical are so compelling that you can start to bootstrap your own storytelling practice by doing some of these things like medical education and medical training. So in terms of partners and relationships, eventually at some point we're going to be going on virtual dates with our partners. And I think it's a little hard to imagine that now. But I think in essence, like your relationships are based upon shared experiences that you have, and that you can start to really dial in eventually at some point going on and building relationships within virtual reality. This already happens online, but having an immersive embodied experience, I think there are people that are going to be able to both become friends, but also eventually find their partner and go on these adventures in virtual reality. And then there's this dimension of empathy and truth and reconciliation, where if I go back to the human domains for virtual reality, there's the self, and then there's the other, and then there's the private and the public, and so the self is your identity, and the other is anything that's other than yourself, and so that's relationship and partners. But it's also being able to empathize with the other, and being able to be in their shoes and walk in their shoes and have this dimension of truth and reconciliation. And so there's an experience called Testimony VR, which is about women who are talking about their own direct experiences of sexual assault. And you just bear witness to their stories and you listen. And I think it's a super powerful idea for what does it mean to be able to have this new level of distributed truth and reconciliation process that can happen within virtual reality. We've already started to see that with the Me Too campaign, but what would it be like for people to be able to share their stories of their direct experiences and for that to be heard? And I think virtual reality, with what I'm seeing with Testimony VR, indicates that it has something to do with how this could scale out to much larger scales. So another domain is death. We're all going to die, spoiler alert. But we have to deal with death and grieving, and I think that grief rituals are going to be a way that we're able to both reckon with our own death, but also connect to other people who are also grieving and going through this process. And so there's an experience called Homestay by Paisley Smith that does an amazing, beautiful job of her using the virtual reality medium to be able to explore her own experience of having, which was essentially an international student stay with her family who committed suicide. And this is a ritual that she had created to be able to reckon with it. And it's just an absolutely amazing piece. So higher education, travel, spirituality, this gets into the concepts of embodied cognition. So embodied cognition essentially means that we don't just think with our brain, we think with our entire bodies. And that when you are able to go into a virtual reality experience and to be immersed in that world, you get your emotions immersed like you're actually there. You're able to actually make choices and take action in a way that's natural and intuitive. These are all the ways that you actually need to be able to learn how to do something. And when you're able to complete that loop within virtual reality through the principles of embodied cognition, it's basically VR is the best training medium that we have. And it's starting with enterprise training, military training, but eventually that's going to get into early education and completely change. Like right now in education, if you are a didactic learner, then you're great, you're going to be set. But there's so many other people who have other learning temperaments. And in virtual reality, they're going to be able to address those people who are visual learners or experiential learners or people who need to have a deeper story and meaning before they really understand why it's important to learn something. You can do all of those things within VR. And so it's also going to help us be able to comprehend complex systems. And so being able to actually visualize that in different ways, but also interact with it and be able to turn it into a little mini game. And then as you play that mini game, you're going to understand some new component of that complex dynamic system. And that's going to be a metaphor, an embodied metaphor that allows you to add that together to be able to understand more and more complex dimensions of society and of reality. And so another thing that VR is doing is it's breaking down academic silos, because VR, at the essence, is centered in the human experience. And so right now in the academic institutions, it's people who are doing very fixed things, but like VR is coming and saying, no, we actually going to bust that all down, and you need to be like essentially like a Renaissance man or Renaissance woman to be able to do VR, because you have to like synthesize so many different dimensions of the human experience. And so we're going to start to see this fusion of the philosophy of mind, the philosophy of science, and philosophy of mathematics, and the art and science, they're all going to be melded together, and the VR is facilitating all these new cross-disciplinary and interdisciplinary collaborations, which I think is really exciting, because that means as a journalist, I can talk to just about anybody who has anything to say about the human experience, and I can make it about VR, because it is about VR. So the other thing is that you can start to do sci-fi world building to be able to shape the future. You're going to be able to prototype, imagine futures, and actually give people an embodied experience of that. And through that, you're going to be able to, start to cultivate an entirely new culture. Imagine like when you go to Burning Man, that's a culture that's been designed out of a kind of a set of constraints of like 1 week. But we're going to be able to start to do that within virtual worlds to be able to like prototype the potential cultures and futures that we want to live into. And then it's going to go from the virtual into the real world at some point. And so that's this roadmap of doing world building and science fiction as a way to actually create the future. So wonder and awe is a huge aspect of, like, wonder and awe means that there's something that you've never experienced before. So it's literally like expanding your mind and your sense of what is real. Blurtasia by Kevin Mack is an amazing experience of this because it just makes you feel like you've seen something that you've never quite seen anything quite like it before. And because of that, then it expands your mind in new and different ways. And so the sense of wonder and awe is something that we're always going to continually be striving for. But what that means is that you have to create new ideas or new experiences that would be completely impossible to have in the real world. And Blurtasia is a great example of that. But the underlying concept of wonder and awe is a really powerful one. So moving on to the career, we have spatial design. So anybody who is designing things in the real world that has a spatial dimension, you can do that now in virtual reality. So whether it's architecture, or designing products, or like big airplanes, whatever it is, if there's a spatial component, there's going to be a part of you actually having an embodied experience of that spatial design before it actually gets created. And so many examples of how doing designs of helicopters or architecture is just it's a no-brainer that this is going to be a win-win situation for VR. Virtual screens for productivity. The resolution on the headsets isn't quite good for you to read text within VR yet, but when it is, then you're going to start to just replace your screen with lots of virtual screens. You're going to have infinite space to be able to do all sorts of things for productivity. And so, but then also being able to add other people collaborating with you at the same time is also going to add, you're going to be able to work from home in a way that, and do things you couldn't do before. So data visualizations is another huge aspect. When you have an embodied experience of data, you can start to talk about that data in a group of people in a way that you couldn't otherwise. And I've seen some demos from Flow Immersive from Jason Marsh that just allows you to have it on a headset with WebVR. You're able to show 30 people the sets of data and then have a conversation about that data in a way that you wouldn't be able to have without having that embodied experience. It's almost like translating data into an architecture of a city. When you've been into a city, you're like, oh yeah, I've been here before. But when you translate that to the abstractions of data, then you have a different experience of that data, and it's going to allow you to have a deeper embodied, intuitive sense of that data. And then that's going to facilitate all sorts of being able to do technical communication and collaboration amongst people. So friends and community, this is one where you're just going to be hanging out with your friends and being able to do stuff in VR. And Rec Room is probably one of the best examples in terms of having lots of robust activities, and there's a lot of user-generated content that's happening there. And so, but your friends are based upon the things that you have shared experiences with. And so in VR, you're going to be able to have these shared experiences with people that are going to be the basis of friendship. And so there's a lot of people who think about it like the difference of virtual reality in real life, and it's not as real, but there's a certain dimension of your experiences in VR that are just as real as anything else. And I think that you're starting to see a lot of people who are forming these really fun foundational friendships and relationships by their experiences that they're having with other people in VR. Now, isolation and immobility, this is a dimension where you're going to be able to combat isolation in different ways. So people, as they grow older, they may be in nursing homes. And so what would it mean to be able to either give them an experience where they could feel like they're able to go in places where they couldn't go before, but imagine that there could be a social dimension of getting people who are in these homes or otherwise completely isolated. Are there ways to actually engage them directly through some sort of social VR experiences with people around the world who you're able to essentially break down the barriers of space and time and be able to make these connections with folks? Identity and embodiment is an area that I think is really interesting just because you have this dimension of expression of identity, and identity is so important for you to be able to express who you are. And in some ways, we're very limited by the meat sacks that we have. You can't completely change the way you look, but in VR, you can be basically anyone you want to, which means that you're able to perhaps be closer to the essence of who you think you are, and to just as you go out and want to really dress up, this is the next level of dressing up, of actually taking on an embodiment, and then having other people react to you in that embodiment, which is going to allow you to tap into different dimensions of your personality that may not have been otherwise easily accessible. But what that's going to do is that it's going to allow you to tap into those parts of yourself and then bring that out into your everyday life, which I think is a huge, interesting aspect. That there's some experiences like VR chat is a great example of just allowing people to do that. And I also think that VR is going to be a training wheel for presence, which means that as you go into VR, you're able to cultivate this sense of active presence and mental and social presence and emotional presence and embodied presence, which means that these are all dimensions of presence that are happening every moment of your life all the time. They're all happening at the same time, and all of your experiences are some sort of combination of these different flavors of presence. But as you go into virtual reality, you're able to cultivate this sense of witnessing consciousness to be able to get at the heart of that experience, and then you're able to pay attention to that more when you're living day to day. And so it's like these training wheels to get you tapped into these deeper levels of presence. So consciousness hacking for me is super fascinating to like, what is it that you go into virtual reality, blaze new neural pathways into your brain, and you're able to change the way that you see the world. And for me, this is exciting because there could be some latent human potentials that we don't even know is possible. Jaron Lanier and Jeremy Bailenson talk about this concept of homuncular flexibility, which means that you can train yourself to have a tail. You can give yourself stimulus that you see the visual input and the stimulus, and you think that you have a tail because there's a part of your brain that used to be a monkey. So you're able to actually like re-tap into that part of your brain and have that experience. And if evolution of the humankind is based upon the context that you're in, then is that going to, over long term, over many generations, change the course of the future of humanity? So to me, this is super exciting because this is latent human potentials that we don't even know that we have, that we can start to build slowly over time. So that's, to me, probably one of the biggest potentials that we don't even know what's going to come from that. But there's other crazy stuff like sensory substitution where you can literally turn your torso into an ear. So if you're deaf and you can put like a haptic vest on, you can take the input from the world and turn that into a sound. And as long as it's in the same data structure that your cochlea is hearing, then you can start to hear, especially if you have the visual synchrony and all that data that's coming into your mind. You can start to see, rewire your brain and to have senses that would have no other way to get into your mind, and you can turn your torso into an ear, which I think is pretty mind-blowing to think about, like thinking about your body as a GPU, which means you can just start putting data into your body, and it's going to take time to do this unconscious learning, but you can have the visual synchrony within VR and train yourself to do stuff that you wouldn't be able to do before. There's going to be a lot of applications of people starting to do that. The other concept of sensory addition, which means that you can start to do senses that we've never even had before. So if you want to know where true north is, you could wear this north paw on your foot, and it's always going to point to you in your direction, like around your ankles, which way north is, and then your body just naturally learns it. Like you just always have this intuition about where north is without you really thinking about it, which the people that have told me that have done this said that there's a certain part where you start to recognize it, but then eventually just sort of you forget that it's even there, you don't even notice it. But your body's processing it at this unconscious level. So you'll be able to see like electromagnetic waves, whatever it is, but our experience as humans is about the senses that we have. And so adding new senses to that palette means it's gonna like change the breadth of what's possible for the potential of the human experience. So the other concept that I think is really powerful is this concept of self-sovereign identity, which means that we're going to be starting to own our own data, and in the virtual world, we're going to have different aspects of ourselves that we're going to be able to control. And when you go into like a bar, for example, you show your ID, but your ID has like where you live and your birth date, and like they don't need to know that. They just need to know that you're 21. So in the virtual world, you're going to have this capability to be able to have all these dimensions of your identity and your personality to be able to automatically show different portions of that. So you have this idea of the metaverse in the open web. You're going to be able to carry your avatar into the metaverse and to be able to actually have different dimensions of expressing yourself. So the 2D web was all about anonymity. The immersive metaverse is all going to be like having an embodied identity that you have different dimensions of control over. And self-sovereign identity is using the blockchain, and I think is going to be a huge part of that, the future of that. Then there's virtual goods for virtual reality. This is essentially the new business models. I've been using a lot of the metaphor of the yang and the yin, and the yang is all about competition. It's like zero-sum game. And the yin is all about cooperation, and it's regenerative, meaning the more that you give, the more that you get. So information is a yin currency, love is a yin currency, open source technologies. But there's different dimensions and advantages of both. So for the yang is very much the walled garden, curated content. It's great with vertical integration, proprietary proprietary app store. You think of the iPhone as a good example of what can happen in a user experience, but they basically control everything. And if you want to be able to put something on your phone, you can't do it. And so people who want to have that freedom, you move over to like the Android to be able to just put any APK that you want on your phone. There's no gatekeepers, and you can do pretty much what you want, but it's not as an integrated or like cohesive experience. So this is a bit of like, right now we're in the young sort of walled garden dimension of the metaverse, but eventually we're going to have like the open web metaverse that's going to have much more of these yin dynamics where you're going to be able to do whatever you want, but it's going to be, in the short term, a lot worse experience. But in the long term, with Metcalfe's law, Metcalfe basically said the value of a network is the number of nodes squared that are involved in that network. So as you have the ability to go into the metaverse and go into all these different dimensions of these different worlds, then you're going to be able to essentially have a huge, we see on the web right now, on the internet, is this huge value that comes from being able to go and have these links. And the equivalent in the metaverse is these portals into these other worlds. And I think that's something to think about in the future with the exponential growth of Metcalfe's law. The open web is going to be where, right now we're in the realm with CompuServe and AOL, and eventually the web overtook those because we don't have those anymore because the value of those networks. And the same thing's going to happen, I think, in the metaverse. So we're going to have virtual gift economies. And so when you have no resource constraints, what's it mean to be able to be like, oh, I like that. I'm going to start to use it. And there's no limitations. You're going to start to have those more yin currency dynamics within the virtual world. People still need to make money, but what does it mean to have this sense of virtual abundance within virtual reality? In terms of the early education and communication, I think this concept of a memory palace is super powerful. Right now we say, oh, we have our phone, we're going to be able to have access to information all the time. I think that's very abstracted and mental, and I think that we're going to be moving into this concept of embodied memory palaces, where you're going to be able to create a representation within a virtual reality, have an embodied experience of that, and it's just going to be in your body. With me doing the virtual reality podcast and doing thousands of interviews, those conversations I'm able to just call upon, and it's changed the way that I think about my memory. And I think as that gets put out into virtual reality, we're going to have like a virtual embodied representation of these concepts and ideas, and it's going to be like going into an interactive museum to be able to learn things, and it's going to be, you're going to learn it better when you have your own sort of memory palace. So that the idea of a decentralized memory palace that you can start to cooperate and share, I think is an exciting one. Telepresence, this just concept that we're going to be able to be get rid of the constraints of space and be able to have these synchronous interactions with people. It's going to allow people to work from home. It's going to allow people to just stay connected to each other a lot more. I think the concept of telepresence, and as you start to get like visual, your emotions and your facial expressions, it's going to like just, once that is there, then it's going to be almost like the interactions you're going to be able to have are going to be completely indistinguishable from reality. And then finally, the home and family, you have the volumetric memories. And so what's it mean to be able to capture your home and to capture your family and be able to archive yourself in a volumetric way for your future ancestors that are going to be looking back on you and be able to have an embodied experience of who you are and what that means. And so I know Facebook has done some early prototyping with that. But just this concept of memories and home and family and your ancestry and where you come from, you're going to be able to change your relationship to that. So those are the different domains of human experience. And just to close things out, in conclusion, some other ideas. I think that models for consciousness, the more that we do VR, we're going to have this rapid prototyping to come up with a theory of consciousness and be able to test it. And so I think that's actually going to change our conceptualization of consciousness potentially. I think it could actually be a metaphysical issue that is beyond the scope of VR actually being able to figure out. Consciousness could be emergent from our neurology, or it could be a fundamental field. Or it could be universal, and I think any of these are possible. But I think that VR is going to be able to transform our consciousness. We're going to be able to go into VR and change who we are. I think it's this concept of being able to have this depth psychological idea of who you are and to go into VR and constantly be evolving and growing. And that's going to have this dimension of cultural transformation. So what's it mean to be able to have a model of moral development and a collective culture and think about how can we evolve the culture so we're not like killing each other and being more empathetic and more kind. But this sense of going from an egocentric to ethnocentric to world-centric, and this growth of being able to live in a way that your values are encompassing as many people as you can, moment to moment, and really have that in an embodied way. So what do I think the ultimate potential of VR is? Well, I sort of go through all these different things, but at the heart, I think it comes down to you're going to be able to be more connected to yourself, be more connected to other people, more connected to the planet, and more connected to all dimensions of reality. So thank you.